Welcome to EFI Connection Back to the Basic videos. Today we are going to be talking about our ultrasonic welder machine. Our Telsonic, or the ultrasonic welder machine, is a machine that creates splices or welds through sonic vibrations. This is a cleaner, more efficient standard practice in the harness building world to create splices instead of soldering. Here is an example of what we are going to be creating today. This is a weld or splice created by our Telsonic. Chris, one of our instructors here at EFI Connection, is going to be demonstrating how to create a splice using our Telsonic.
I'm Chris, and I'm going to be demonstrating how to use the Telsonic ultrasonic welder today. We have a little bit of prep. We have to turn on the air compressor. We have to have our safety glasses, and we also have to have our wires already cut for the splices. Before we get going on our splices, we need to get the air compressor turned on. Inside this room with the danger ear protection is our air compressor. Sometimes it's loud, sometimes it's not, so we have our ear protection in just in case. We open this up. There is a light switch right inside the door. So even though this is running, I'm going to show you there are buttons right on the front of the compressor. There's a green, red, the blue ones you don't need to worry about. So to get this started, all you have to do is press the green button. That starts the compressor. We're going to come over here to the right. There's a big green button. This is our air dryer, which dries the air so we don't get water inside the lines. We just turn that on. And then one last step is over in the corner of the room. Up top here is a lever. It is usually shut at the end of the night. That shuts off the air to the whole building. So for us to get air through the building, we need to turn that back on. So it airs up everything for the CNC machines and for the Telsonic and for our laser room. First step after having all that stuff done is to turn the machine on, which is the big red knob on the front. Give it a quarter of a turn. You'll hear a beep, and you can wait for it to boot up. All right, now that the machine is up and running, it's not quite ready to be used yet. We need to do two things before we can start getting into our splices. First, we're going to press the reset button, which is a little gray button down here. The machine will start to do some of its work, and then the next thing it's going to say is it needs a reference point. So there are two ways to do the referencing. There is a foot switch down here in the red, and you can pull it out, you can move it. You can either use that, you press it with your foot and hold it, or the same object is this little button off to the left here. And if you press and hold that, it's the exact same thing as if you pressed your foot pedal. Both of them do the exact same thing, but you have to press and hold them. So I always use my finger, and I press and I hold it, and you'll see this assembly close. And don't stick your fingers in there. So as it's doing its measurements, you have to keep it held until it is completely done and it opens back up. Once that is done, it'll do one more reference, and that is all said and done. So now that the machine is up and running, today I'm just going to show you how to do a simple splice. It is going to be one 20 gauge wire to another 20 gauge wire. They've already been cut in the wire machine that you've learned in another video. They've already been stripped to the proper length. So the first thing we need to do is we need to use the screen. It's a touch screen. We're going to press open. We're going to open up a splice. And I'm going to type in on the keyboard 20. And I have a generic 20 gauge, one wire to one wire. I'll press and select it, then press open. And there it shows I have one wire. It's going to be my sonic weld, and then my other 20 gauge wire. So since I'm just showing you a generic one, I just also want to state that if you are doing a build, when you press open and you type in your part number, it will have splice numbers to correlate with the splice numbers in the build sheet that you are working with. So whether it be splice 1, SP-1, or splice 2, SP-2, all of that will be laid out in there, and you can open up the direct file that correlates to the splice that you're going to be doing. So I'm going to press open, splice, type in my part number, which would be 100 1-02107. And say I want to do splice 1. I would hit the arrow down to splice 1, select it, and hit open, and that would show me the splice that I would like to work with. If you're working with a different splice, it's the same process. Open, splice, and I'm doing two 20 gauge wires, so I will type in 20 gauge, 1 to 1, open, and there's my two 20 gauge wires. And the machine will make noise as it switches its calibration for whatever file you are working with. We need our safety glasses before we start welding. We'll put our safety glasses on. We'll grab our wires. Our program will show you which side the wires go to. This is just a generic program, so it doesn't matter which side, what color, because these are just not for anything except for demonstration purposes. So the way they go in there is you line one up inside there, and the second one will go right on top of it. So when you line them up, you want them to be almost butt to butt. You don't want them past each other. You don't want them too far away. You want them right together, lined up. You do that, you're actually doing that in this bell, what they call, and you want it to line up right in the center. Then when you're ready, you can either press the foot pedal or use the finger button like I use right here. Press. And when it's all said and done, you should have two wires that are sonically welded together. Small bundles like this aren't very hot. The larger wires you get into and the more wires you get into, they can get hot. So when you pull them out, if you have a large bundle, make sure you don't touch them because you can burn your fingers. The next process after this would be covering this up with shrink tubing to protect it. So now that we have our sonic welded assembly and we're ready to cover it, we need to protect this. So we have a lot of our heat shrink tubing is here in various sizes. Most of these have no adhesive in them. So when we are doing a sonic weld cover, we try to use shrink tubing with adhesive in it. So if we come over to this side of the table, almost all of this has adhesive in it other than this flat stuff. So we need to find a piece that's not too big, but that will still fit over top of this. So we have this size, which I think it is 1/8 of an inch. And what we are going to do is come back over here. There's a tape measure usually always sitting here. We're going to measure 1.5 inches. I'll mark it with my thumbnail. Set that down. Grab a pair of scissors. Slide it right up to my thumbnail and cut it. So I have 1.5 inch piece of shrink tubing. I'll set that to the side. Here's our heat shrink gun. On the bottom, there is a lever for turning it on. It has two different settings on it. So we flip it all the way up to 2. You'll see there is a temperature guide on there. It is going to get over 500 degrees. And do not touch any of the silver parts because it will instantly burn you. While that is running, you can slide this piece of heat shrink tubing over the end of your wire. And what we need to try to do is to get this piece of heat shrink tube centered as good as we can over top of that weld. So what I do is I mark my thumbnail and I slide it to it. Mark my thumb on this side, pull it over to see if it's about the same, which it was. So I can slide it back over. And then I'm going to slide one end of this in the heat shrink tube, or under the heat gun, to get it started. And it will slowly shrink up, and then I can slide it in there to the rest of the heat. Not to get your fingers too close because it will burn you as the heat is coming out. And I'll spin it a little bit. Make sure I go back and forth a little bit. And when I come back, you can usually see a little bit of an indent where that sonic weld nugget is. The next step would be to set that down, reach underneath, or you can flip it up if you need to. We're going to flip it to number 1 and let it run for a little bit. And you'll notice that the temperature is now dropping, and it will drop the temperature down to about 120 degrees if you let it run for about 10 to 15 seconds. And what I normally do is I just reach my finger underneath here and flip it off. And then you will get a little red light that starts blinking. That's warning you that this has been used and that it's possibly hot, so please do not touch it. And that is the end of heat shrinking and closing up your sonic weld.